Hi, I'm Madeleine Mineau, the Executive Director of Clean Energy New Hampshire, and I'm your moderator for today's live panel focused on new and emerging technology within the renewable energy sector and how this technology may impact New Hampshire's path forward to a clean energy future. Clean Energy New Hampshire is an organizing partner of New Hampshire Energy Week, and we plan events like these every year. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to give a quick thank you to our Apex sponsor this year, Natixis, and remind you all to use the link in the description below to sign up for the remaining events this week, including our Energy Champion Award ceremony. I also want to let you know that this is being recorded, and we will send out the link to all of those that had registered after the event. You may also use the Q&A panel on the control panel to the right of your screen to ask questions at the end of the panel when we open it up for audience questions. We wanted to make this session interactive, so we decided to add a few poll questions to test out your knowledge of New Hampshire energy trivia. So we're going to go ahead and put up our first poll questions to get you warmed up and involved in our session. So the first question is, in what year did the New Hampshire legislature establish the renewable portfolio standard? You can go ahead and answer. I'll give you a little time to think about it. So for those of you who may not know, the renewable portfolio standard is an important policy that sets renewable energy goals for the state. It's also important for fuel diversity and economic development in our state. Great. So looks like most of you got the correct answer, which was 2007. Excellent. Good job, everyone. I'm impressed with your New Hampshire energy knowledge. Now that we've got your attention, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists for today's conversation. First, we have Daniel Schwarting, Supervisor of Transmission Planning at ISO New England, which is a nonprofit corporation responsible for the operation and planning of New England's power system and the administration of its electricity markets. He has been a member of the transmission planning team since 2010, focusing on maintaining long-term electric reliability and interconnecting new generation resources in the 3 northern New England states. He's also represented New England on groups coordinating reliability standards and system studies with neighboring system operators in New York and Eastern Canada. Dan is a professional engineer licensed in the states of Massachusetts and holds a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's degree in electric power engineering from RPI. Welcome, Daniel. Next we have, great. Next we have April Salas, who is the Executive Director of the Revers Center for Energy at the Dartmouth Tuck School of Business. Thank you for joining us today, April. And our third panelist is Professor Xiaowei Teng, Professor and Chair of the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. Welcome, Professor Teng, and thanks for being here. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. As I stated at the start of our program, today's panel is going to be focused on new and emerging renewable energy technology opportunities in New Hampshire and our path forward to a clean energy future. We'll be hearing from our panelists why they are all invested in the work of new and emerging renewable energy technology, why it matters, and how various types of new and emerging renewable energy technology could actually touch down in New Hampshire communities. First, I'd love to give each panelist a few minutes to highlight their work. First, let's hear from Dr. Teng. Your work on energy storage was recently featured in UNH's Innovation of the Month. That's where we heard about it and extended this invitation to you. Can you tell us what you've been working on and how it relates to our clean energy future?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Madeleine. It's my pleasure to be here. So my research at University of New Hampshire is working on the aquaphase energy storage. Basically, we are researching a new technology, battery technology, can replace lithium-ion batteries. We're going to use water-based electrolyte, use zinc metal instead of lithium metal as a charge carrier. So there's several reasons we want to study and researching new technology moving away from lithium-ion battery. The first one is lithium is really not earth-bound material, right? So if you look at reserves on land regarding lithium, 6 countries possess more than 98% of lithium reserve on land. They are, I think they are Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, US, China, and Australia. So geographically, lithium actually even more unevenly distributed than petroleum, right? So the second reason is well, lithium metal is a pretty inflammable material. It's very easy to catch fire. May not be the very safe way to do that, and its own abundance is really not huge, as I mentioned. North America produce 10 million cars per year. Globally, car manufacturing about 100 million per year. So the lithium production, global production, can only afford 10 million electrical vehicles. So there is a mismatch. That's only talk about electrical vehicle, not to mention about utility, all the storage, stationary storage. So that's the reason our research funded by Department of Energy try to seeking for the alternative technology in the long run, more sustainable, lower cost, and much more environmentally friendly than current lithium-ion battery technology.
That's great. Thank you for sharing your work. I think we're all very interested to see where it leads. Next, I'll turn to April. One of the more popular yet still quite obscure topics in the future of energy that we hear a lot about is transactive energy. Can you give us a quick overview of what that entails and your work related to it?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me today. I think it's one of the more popular topics, certainly as we're looking at more digital innovation within the power space, and as we look at flexible generation assets, and we hear a lot of talk about, solarizing homes. We're seeing legislation change in California and increasingly being introduced across the country to increase not only the efficiency of buildings in the built environment, but also, installing or encouraging things like renewable energy mandates as we look at any new built infrastructure. A lot of the communities that we're working with and companies that we're working with across the US are also trying to manage, I think, a really delicate balance between the needs of the future energy system and what our sort of current built environment looks like today. And as we shift towards more variable renewable resources and hopefully a marketplace that will follow, a lot of the work that I'm doing with our students is on everything from the enabling technologies like smart metering infrastructure down to the policy and regulatory level, at the state, Public Utilities Commission or Service Department and on down. And then also looking at different really aggressive decarbonization or clean energy deployment goals that are either at the state, national, or sort of regional level. And so we're really digging into a lot of the questions that I think dance around the sort of elephant in the room that you're talking about, which is transactive energy. And what's been really important is some work that we're doing with the National Academies of Science, looking at global emerging technologies and how the role for transactive marketplace would really unlock, I think, some of the financing and capital needs to make these technologies deployed really worth the while. And then we're looking at, different use cases in Australia and increasingly how it's being considered here in the United States. So I think a lot of the work that we've been focusing on and at the center is looking at that, what sort of emerging technologies and focus there is on transactive platforms on a global level, especially in frontier economies where it may not exist. We have an opportunity to maybe start from a framework that makes it really worth its while. And how do we deploy some of those lessons learned here in the United States and then more specifically here in New England? So, increasingly the work that we're doing within the region is also looking at some of the national and international trends and saying, what applies to us here in New England and then more specifically here in New Hampshire.
Great, thank you so much. Next, I'll turn to Daniel. There's been a lot of discussions regionally about ISO New England's role in the region's clean energy future. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges with transmission planning that might be required to be able to host large amounts of renewables that might be coming online to meet some of the state's policy goals?
Absolutely. So to give a very quick overview of what transmission planning does in ISO New England, our main goal is just to make sure that we have a strong enough transmission system to get power from where it's being generated to where customers in New England are consuming it. And there's a few challenges that come up when we talk about a high renewable energy future, looking at 2030, 2040, 2050. One of the first is just that the location of where that power is being generated tends to change quite a bit. Instead of having major centralized generating stations that a lot of times are not too far from where the load is located, we're now looking at things like offshore wind on the shore of Cape Cod or the Gulf of Maine. We're looking at onshore wind that is in places like northern Maine or northern New Hampshire that's a little bit harder to access with transmission. Additionally, we're seeing a lot more distributed generation than we used to. So things like rooftop solar or small solar or combined heat and power installations. We at ISO New England have a lot less direct visibility and controllability over those resources. And so that's something that we're having to adjust to. Another challenge that comes up there, kind of related to the visibility and controllability of those distributed resources, is that a lot of them have output that's really dependent on the time of day or weather conditions. Things like wind farms or solar panels are only going to produce power when weather allows. And we are working on a lot of different ways to forecast that, and we're actually doing pretty well with that. We've already seen quite a bit of development of solar resources, especially in Massachusetts and some of the other states in southern New England. And so we've been able to improve our forecasting quite a bit. We are expecting, though, that by 2030, we're going to be seeing some new system conditions that are completely unlike anything that we see today. As an example, we're looking at minimum load conditions in the middle of the day. Historically, power consumption in New England is lowest at night. And by 2030, if you look at a nice sunny, mild spring weekend day, we're expecting to see power consumption on the transmission system at about a third of what it is during the overnight periods today, just because so much of that power is coming from rooftop solar installations and other behind the meter generation rather than from the transmission system. We're looking at a couple of challenges related to that. One question is simply, what do we do with all that power? If we don't have a lot of load in New England, and if wind farms are generating, nuclear power plants are still online, we are going to have to curtail something, and we're taking a look at what that might mean. There are also some interesting implications for high voltage in the transmission system, and also transmission system stability. So what happens in the 5 or 10 seconds after a lightning strike or a tree branch impact on a power line or some other unexpected event. Right now, we do have a project going that we're calling Transmission Planning for the Clean Energy Transition. I hope I'm still audible. I see my Wi-Fi might have cut out for just a second there, so I apologize.
We can still hear you, but we can't see you. So
okay,
and there you are. Now we can see you and hear you.
So we do have this effort going on at ISO New England's Planning Advisory Committee, which is a stakeholder group that's open to any interested stakeholder in the energy industry here in New England. What we're doing with that effort is really trying to find the right balance between, on one hand, the transmission system's ability to accommodate renewable resources, and on the other hand, the cost of developing the transmission system. We realize that there's really a spectrum there between an economical system that maybe isn't as able to accommodate renewables and a very expensive system that can accommodate all of the wind and solar power that we try to connect. And so that's an effort that we're doing right now, trying to work with stakeholders to find the right balance between those two sides of the spectrum.
Great, thank you. That was great. Before we move on to the discussion portion of our program with the panelists, I'm going to go ahead and ask Sheila or Brianna to put up our second audience poll question to test your knowledge of New Hampshire energy trivia. And that question is, what percentage of electricity used in New Hampshire is currently generated in state by solar generation? And the choices are 0.54%, 0.88%, 1.2%, or 2.19%. For reference, we were talking about the RPS earlier in the question, and our goal in the Renewable Portfolio Standard is to get to 0.7% by 2025. So the choices alone in this question may indicate that we're already ahead of that. Most of you guessed 1.2%. The correct answer is 0.88%. So we are ahead of our RPS goal for 2025, but we certainly have a lot more deployment potential to come. Great. Thank you all for participating in those little trivia questions. So now we're going to move on to a little bit more of a discussion question where all the panelists will have the opportunity to answer the same question. I'll let any of you chime in that would like. So the question is, over the past few years, we've started seeing more and more investment into new technologies like storage, electric vehicles, and beyond. Do you all think that these investments are happening fast enough? What more do we need in order to bring the technologies we need to scale at the speed that really we would like to see?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think putting on my policy hat and knowing that I came from Federal Department of Energy and led development of the Quadrennial Energy Review, our first sort of attempt at a national comprehensive policy. I think one of the things that I think would be really additive, and I think we're starting to see signals in this current administration, is just a strong signal and also some procurement action to speed up the rate and pace of change. I think it's not necessarily that the industry is moving in the direction. I think it's how fast it's going to move, and you really need scale for that. And so because we are in sort of a federated system, which is the lovely aspects of our country, it also means that there's sort of 50 different markets and rules and regulations, which doesn't inherently support sometimes the broadest deployment and scale in a consistent way that signals the private markets to deploy these technologies. Because most of the industry is owned and operated outside of the federal government, I think that's where we really need either a solid policy statement and some certainty over the horizon for that, and then also an action in bulk, and at scale that helps to continue to drive down prices of key technologies, but that also puts procurement action behind those intentions. And so I feel like there's some certainty in the next, well, I shouldn't say certainty, nothing's ever certain, but a signal of certainty in alignment in the federal and regulatory space at the federal level, which I hope and I really think will be a prerequisite for really unlocking what's been happening over the last 4 years. Solar deployment hasn't necessarily slowed down, but I think in terms of where it's signaling and smart transportation and mobility and some of the other infrastructure bills that we think we will anticipate seeing coming out of the federal administration, I think that's where we're going to see the pace pick up, quite markedly from the previous 4 and even 8 years. And I think it's really about that consistency over those horizons that will help signal the market. Not only is this clear in terms of upping production, but also there's a market out there that's demanding the product.
Yeah, I would add.
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
So I would add, I think there are certain technologies that are taking off at a pretty good clip. If we look at the development of solar power, for example, the cost of solar panels has been dropping pretty precipitously over the last few years. Every year, ISO New England puts out a long-term forecast for power consumption, but also for behind-the-meter solar production. And every year, that forecast just keeps going up and up and up. There are certain things that I think will become more important. One of them, to Dr. Teng's research, is storage. When we see things like an oversupply of renewable energy in the in the middle of a spring day, we are going to need to be able to bank some of that energy for other times. Another thing that I think we need to keep an eye on is the development of distribution systems for electric vehicle charging. We can design our transmission system to get power for EV charging to maybe the nearest town or the nearest substation to someone's house, but the last few miles, if you will, the distribution circuits throughout each town are probably going to need some upgrades to handle the increased load of electric vehicle charging. And if we look out even further into the future, things like home heating electrification, which is on the horizon as kind of a long-term decarbonization strategy.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing. We definitely recognize it's a very fast pace for electric vehicle and solar panel in the past decades. There's something a little bit tricky is when we talk about battery technology, the one we are very familiar with, we see the big changing of lithium battery manufacturing and marketing, and it's very deep decrease of price in the past 5 years. However, one thing we have to consider is the recycling technology not ready. So if you look at most frequently used battery technology, actually car battery, right? So lead acid batteries. So you bought a battery from AutoZone, you return it, you get a $19 rebate, and the government, New Hampshire government, recycle everything. And for electrical vehicle, there's no established protocol to recycle those lithium battery, which contain, they are spent battery, contain lots of precious materials. And many of the material in quite dangerous conditions, flammable, toxicity, so on and so forth. And it's something have to be paid attention as compared to the other battery technology. Another thing is, electric vehicle battery, lithium battery is still a small portion of the market. Utility hasn't been picked up very much. But if you think about large-scale implementation of lithium batteries, there are a huge challenge for supply chains. So the most popular lithium battery is lithium cobalt oxide. And the cobalt, we all know that 70% of cobalt production comes from one single country in Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, right? So it will be the issues. Tesla just recently changed from lithium cobalt battery technology for their vehicle into the lithium nickel, which is unfortunately better energy density on one side, but on the other side, it's a shorter shelf life. You probably have to replace battery much more frequently than 7 years. You probably have to replace in 5 years. So there's another challenge for recycling everything. So and also the workforce will be the issue, right? So how do we prepare the students or middle-aged worker to shifting their current skill set to this new technology, and what type of a training they need, and where they could have these trainings? Will New Hampshire invest on such training workforce developments? So I see the bright future. I see the strong pace. That's everything very, very important, because we pay more and more attention to the climate, to the environmental impact. But there's also others related issue, we need to pay attention and have to plan earlier, plan ahead.
Yeah, those are all great points. I agree. I testify a lot at the State House, and I get asked already questions about what will happen to solar panels at their end of life. Are we planning ahead for that, for recycling programs? So folks are certainly starting to think about it. And we had a whole panel on workforce last week, and so we certainly are thinking about that and how we're going to satisfy those needs. My next question for you all is that New Hampshire belongs to a regional electric grid. And frankly, we're surrounded by states that have vastly more ambitious clean energy policies. What do you all think that are steps that New Hampshire could take to keep pace if we want to, get more serious about having a clean energy future and accelerating clean energy deployment in New Hampshire? Why don't we have April start, since we'll go in the same order that you answered last time, if you want.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'm probably mixing hats, but I think the answer is at a minimum local choice. Be supportive of local choice. That's inherent to New Hampshire as a state. So we're not trying to go against the grain here, but supporting the choice of local community where there's broad scale, I think support for decarbonization strategies at the local level. One, because they're good for the environment, but two, and most importantly, we can stabilize and reduce costs. Electric power costs are so high here. And I think if you look at the residential level, the cost of the fully integrated line item, if you will, in a residential, from the resident's perspective, includes, heating the home too. And so as we think about the thermal requirements as well as the electric power requirements, and now people are potentially wanting to either take advantage of a community solar or rooftop solar and charge their electric vehicles and just make those individual choices. How do we think about supporting those needs? And so what's inherent, I think in New Hampshire's ability today is to continue to support and be a strong proponent of local choice and supporting communities that are looking to be really ambitious in price stabilization, in decarbonization, but also economic productivity, as was just mentioned, related to jobs. We have a real opportunity to be a market leader in the region and at a minimum amongst our peers in having a strong target, but also supporting the development of a local workforce for the energy needs of the future, the energy system of the future. And the energy system, as Daniel described, is shifting. And as was described on the technology side, is also, the price is coming down and the availability is also increasing. And so as we're shifting towards more hyper-localized consumer choice and the ability to bring some of those variable renewables down to the community scale, or even think about it from a regional scale, we can be a participating partner at the sub-state level, and then certainly at the regional level to be going in on joint RFP procurements. We know offshore wind is coming. We should be positioning to be a part of that value chain and or supply chain, as we're looking at our European partners setting up shop here in New England, which they've been doing for a number of years. And so how do we position ourselves as a state and then more hyper locally as individual communities to continue to develop that workforce and avail that choice so that we can have access to to the system of the future. Because I think what we've all seen is it's not slowing down, and I don't think we can reverse course, and I don't think we should be wanting to necessarily have to continue to talk about competition between, the thermal system, the winter peaking needs, and heating homes. I managed some of the cold snaps when I was at the federal level when we had heating oil shortages. I would never want to have to go back to a time where we're talking about, people either unable to pay or unable to find the supply for winter heating fuels, for example. So, I think there are some really specific and actionable things that we can take under our belt today that make us a good value contributor within the region, and that also provide direct value to local communities and to, our economic, well-being in the state of New Hampshire.
Great. We're certainly seeing a lot of great example of local leadership in New Hampshire. So we like to cheer those on and certainly not get in the way. Daniel, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the nice things about not being first is you do have the opportunity to learn lessons from those who were first. Going back to April's point from a couple minutes ago, there are 50 different states with 50 different sets of energy policies in the US, and some of them right here in New England have learned some lessons, both good and bad. On the good side, I would say, encouraging energy efficiency and encouraging things like the development of distributed rooftop solar, those policies really work. If you take a look at our power consumption here in New England, our all-time peak happened in 2006. And despite having plenty of hot, humid summer days since, we've never really come close to that power consumption since then. And really the main reason for that has been state level energy efficiency programs, and more recently the incentives for rooftop solar, which have really driven down power consumption in New England. Another thing I would add on kind of a different note is, there are different parties that are impacted differently in any transition, and the clean energy transition is no different. And I think it is helpful to think ahead to a point where some of the legacy generating units might be retiring. And as we've seen in other parts of New England, that can have a lot of different impacts. It has impacted capacity prices in some parts of New England in the capacity markets that ISO New England runs. It has led to transmission system upgrades in many different areas. And on even more of a local level, think about things like the property tax base in a town when a generating plant that might be one of the major taxpayers retires. Being able to think ahead and looking at some of the other communities in New England and seeing how things like that have affected those communities and how they've dealt with it, it might be possible to learn some good lessons from the neighboring states here.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Daniel and April has been said. Distributed generation definitely going to be a plus to energy system. One thing I want to add on top of this is, when we talk about renewable energy generation, that's definitely a great thing. But never forget resiliency of the energy supply. What we have heard, early spring in Texas, the big storm coming, and many people lose power. And unfortunately, if you look at it nowadays, our weather become more and more unpredictable. Past weekend, Saturday, I drive my kids to Manchester. It snows big on the Road 101, and today it's gonna be 70 degrees. It's only like 4 days apart. It's one of the consequences of climate change. I would say that we're gonna see this more and more often. So then again, when we adopt renewable energy and distributed power generation, at one side save our electrical bill and help save the cost and improve life quality, but at the same time, in the state level, in the national level, they probably have a little bit better planning for the resiliency awareness, preparation for the unpredicted weathers. I would say probably have to keep a certain of old traditional power generation system in case something happen. In case you don't have a sunlight for 3 straight days, what's gonna happen? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, certainly, balancing resilience with new technologies is certainly something that is an important discussion to have, and we'll look forward to having more of those in the future as we start to work on all of this. So my next question is for all of you is kind of a fun one. If I could give you a magic wand and it would magically scale up one technology, make it widely available and cheap, that would have a great benefit for our energy system, a technology that's currently not there, but we could snap our fingers and boom, it's there. What technology would you pick to use your magic wand on? April, I'll start with you.
Oh, darn.
Oh no, if you need more time to think, I can reverse the order.
No, I mean, I have a boring one, but I think it's not broadly available yet. I see that there's hints of it coming in the market, and I think the enabling technology for all of this reminds me of the Recovery Act funding under the Obama administration, which is we need to not only move away from analog metering infrastructure, and people talk about smart meters, but really what I've seen is a slow crawl towards digital meters. But really what we need to get to, and back to the work that I'm doing right now on transactive energy, is more smart controls and access to enabling technologies that will unlock future markets that we see coming. There are some like this, town of Hanover, who are already purchasing in the wholesale markets. They can buy and trade in more near real time. But as we're looking to bring the cost curve down on these distributed resources, there is a value to them. And I think it's being contemplated at the ISO, it's being contemplated at FERC. How do we think about the enabling technologies that are required to really unlock this at scale? And it really has to get down into that smart infrastructure and smart metering and transactive platforms that enable much more broad scale inclusion of prosumers, of the producer consumers at the residential on upscale. Daniel might be shuddering right now trying to think about balancing load and future needs of the grid as they're looking at month out and further. But I think honestly what we may see is where this technology will really unlock the value of all of these distributed technologies and actually give us a true marketplace.
So it's funny that you mentioned that, April. Certainly the the metering infrastructure I think is important, and to your point about trying to balance all of that, we are looking ahead at ISO New England right now to FERC Order 2222, which some folks might already be familiar with, but essentially what that does is allows large collections of distributed resources or even demand reduction to participate in our markets as kind of a virtual power plant, if you will. And that is certainly no small task to get that in order, but it is something that we're looking ahead to and may actually be very helpful in terms of visibility of some of these resources. For my magic wand, if you will, the technology that I would choose is long-term energy storage. And what I mean by long-term is instead of something like existing battery technology, which does a pretty good job of hour to hour or the daily load cycle, I think what we're really going to need is something that can bank energy from 1 month to the next. When we look ahead to 2040 or 2050, we see situations where right around this time of the year, in April or May, we have plenty of wind, the sun's shining very well. There's not really a lot of power consumption because temperatures are pretty mild. And we are going to have more renewable energy than we ever need. At the same time, if you look ahead to July or August, wind tends to be a little bit lower and power consumption is a lot higher. If you look to January or February, solar production is a lot lower because the days are shorter and there are some days when there's snow on solar panels. And so we're really going to need some way to, or we might need some way to bank that energy from the spring and fall periods where we have plenty of it into the summer or winter periods where we really need it. That's one of the things that really makes the last 10 or 20% of decarbonization really difficult. The first 80, 90% or so is relatively easier than that last little bit. And I think long-term energy storage could go a long way towards getting us there.
This is a zillion-dollar question, Madeleine is just asking. I like the idea April proposed, smart media. I like the idea long-term storage can hold for months or even several months storage technology. That's really great challenge and very, very intriguing. If you allow me to elaborate a little more, you ask us to come up, if we have a magic finger, come up with technology, right? Regardless of time, regardless feasibility. I'll probably just propose nuclear fusion. I mean, I personally believe, most of the energy on Earth ultimately it comes from the sun. I mean, if you look at everything energy, so-called crisis, right, whatever, it's a mismatch between the limited resource we have on Earth versus increasing world population and improving life quality. This mismatch never be reconciled each other. It's existing, gonna become larger and larger differences. So I really feel the ultimate solution for energy is artificial sun nuclear fusion, right? Use water, tritium and deuterium to make a huge amount of energy. Actually, I don't think this, we'll say future technology is far, far away. 100 years ago, we cannot imagine internet computer, right? Now it showed up. Nowadays, in the United States and other European countries, Asian countries work together to work on the nuclear fusion. Many countries work together, able to achieve nuclear fusion, but it's not economical. The more energy you produce, the energy you harvest. But if you give another, I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, another 200 years, maybe human beings are able to harness this particular form of energy. Really, we are able to get a clean energy, much more abundant than whatever we have nowadays. But it do need a crystal ball to do that.
Sounds good. I love all of your answers. So I'm going to open it up to audience questions. All of you in the audience are welcome to enter in any question you might have for our panelists into the Q&A box in your control panel. We've already gotten a couple of questions, so I will get to that without further ado. We've got one question about carbon capture technology. We didn't really talk about that. So, when we think about we need to quickly make a move to, no or low carbon emitting resources to address climate change, obviously, if carbon capture, could happen and we could scale it up and it could be successful, we wouldn't have to be as limiting on the emission side because we could recapture those emissions. What do you all think is the feasibility of successful carbon capture at scale, and what role do you think it'll play in addressing climate change and carbon emissions?
Well, I can go as a start. I think it's going to have to be a part of the play. It's kind of like getting to 100% renewables. You're going to have something in that sort of last mile to get you there. And I think decarbonization and efficiency have to be the prevailing schools of thought. We have to just be more efficient in what we use and use less. But outside of that, at scale, I mean, we are sort of faced with a really global, large-scale problem, and carbon capture, I think, is going to have to be a part of that, the mix to get us to where we need to be. And so I think that has to also include land-based as well as water-based technologies that sequester carbon most effectively. And we hear about varying technologies from obviously averting deforestation. We saw what was happening in the Amazon, but I also think we need to pay a lot of attention to our seas and what's happening with sort of the warming oceans and the cycle there, because the oceans capture a lot more carbon than we'd like to give them credit for, and they're a part of the mix. So stepping back and looking at the globe as a whole, I think in order for us to achieve our targets, carbon capture is going to have to be a part of the solution, and it's going to have a level of scale. But I don't think it should be a focus at the behest of efficiency and using less and using what we do use more efficiently.
I agree completely. I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not a cure-all, if you will. I think one of the really hard parts from what I know about it is the scale is just difficult. You do, at least with the current methods used for carbon capture and sequestration, you need certain types of geologic formations to store carbon underground and that sort of thing, and that just isn't available everywhere. So. I think it is an important piece for that last couple of percent. Things like, say aviation fuel or cement production or some other processes that are really hard to decarbonize. But I think it's probably better that we save it for those really hard things and not just assume that it can kind of solve everything, if you will.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm research. I'm university professor working on a research project. I actually really believe in carbon capture, but I agree with Daniel that if you capture carbon dioxide and put it on geographic storage, it didn't solve the problem. It just delays outbursts of the problem. I really think that science and technology should be able to find a feasible way to reverse the generation of carbon dioxide, which means will be more enticing to capture those carbon dioxide using scientific way to upgrade them to the more value-added chemicals, right? In a very one of the research in the science and technology in the catalysis field, people dream of called dry reforming, which basically methane react with carbon dioxide to forming other chemicals. And this is a dream reaction people are looking forward to, right? You have two most abundant carbon one chemical, and you don't really want this methane, greenhouse gases and CO2 combined together. Are we able to form something more valuable? People able to use as a fuel of the other things. It's not a technology. It's ready now, but we live in a carbonist world. We utilize energy most likely by combustion. Human body does that way, right? So there are gonna be inevitable carbon dioxide generation not from human activity, from animal activity, whatever activities. So it's hard, but we should invest on the technology to capture and really upgrade carbon dioxide into something more useful, not just merely just store them for later on. That's won't solve the problem. And inject carbon dioxide into the ocean, that's what we are doing. It may not be the ultimate solution. You cause the acidification of the ocean. There's lots of other ecological changes. So we don't have the perfect technology, but that's, countries should, federal government should invest on to upgrading carbon dioxide. Capture is just first step. Have to convert it. That's the better way to describe it.
Right. I like this one because I haven't really thought about this too much. Do any of you know what the most promising replacement for silicon in solar panels would be, given that silicon is expensive? So we've seen rapid drops in solar costs, right, in PV costs, but I think we might have to start replacing some of the components in those panels to see further significant drops. Are you aware of any of these upcoming promising changes? We're pondering that one.
I'll admit that's not one that I'm familiar with, but I think it's a very good question.
I can add on this. Silicon, single crystal silicon and polycrystalline silicon are the dominating solar material because they are inexpensive. That's the reason they are popular. However, there are lots of researching on the polymer-based PV material. They are not as inexpensive as silicon-based material. It's a durability not as good as silicon, because silicon is really hard material. It's durable, right? And however, I think it's at least for research level, it shows great promise in terms of efficiency. They are much lower, only like a 1 or 2% compared to 15% of silicon. They are still very low, but it can be very, very versatile. You can think about, you can paint as they are soft, flexible. You can bend it. You can make it on the clothing or put on top of the car, and even the umbrella, right? It's promising. I think the technology not in the marketplace. It's just economic reasons, because silicon is so inexpensive, right? However, if you content everything together, just like a carbon tax or everything together, thinking about this, I think there should be eventually should come up very competitive in terms of price, and then manufacturing silicon, high purity silicon, is a very energy intensive and a very polluting process. Yeah, it's compared to other technology. So
yeah, I think. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, April.
I was just going to say, on that note, I think there's also an opportunity to learn from our international partners and some of the technologies they've been exploring. In particular, I take my students for one of our global Insight Expedition courses to Morocco, and we look at the Noor complex in Ouarzazate, Morocco. And, while they have the solar PVs, they're also experimenting with things like parabolic trough technology that heats a liquid, the transfer fluid that then warms up molten salt for grid scale storage. It's an at-scale solution, so it's not necessarily a on your roof type of thing. And we've experimented here in Nevada as well with mirror technology, but so I can't speak to whether, it's necessarily the best application for every geography, but I think the important point is, we can sort of learn from international partners who are exploring different solar collection technology and technologies and types that may inform where appropriate and geographically we can experiment with things alternative to solar PVs.
Yeah, completely agree with April. It's fascinating. I travel to China often. My family, my parents still live in China. I visit the rural area for my personal interest. I do see lots of rooftop solar devices. There's not PV at all. It's just a very thin glass tube. You flow water inside. You can heat up the cold water in the warm water very, very easily, very efficiently. It's very, very low investment cost, but very, very beneficial. And also, you think about a heat pump, right? It's a technology been there for decades. It's not a PV technology, but it works very well. So I really think there's a existing technology, maybe not as reputed as a PV, but they are working very much.
Yeah, it reminds me of the storage conversations. And our students, we always have this conversation. By the end of our trip in Morocco, they know not to say storage is batteries. There are many storage technologies. And this is the solar conversation I always get to as well. So your point's well made. And they're experimenting with some really interesting technologies like dry cooling, using water, but how do we think about the whole sort of ecosystem of water use, et cetera? And these, raw material inputs. But I think the point is made. We can sort of pick our heads up and see what's happening around the world that we may be able to transfer by way of technologies that are applicable here in certain geographies, that we can certainly learn from and that are active in the market. They're tried and tested, and we don't have to, play first mover and buy expensive things that may not sustain in our climate.
Great, that's a great lead into the next and probably last question I'm going to ask you all. The question was focused on New England states, but I'm going to make it broader to really any other state or country that you want to think about. What state or country do you think New Hampshire could look to as an example for a place that's really been successful in supporting the growth of new energy technologies? And maybe what's been the key to that success for them?
I mean, we just come from, I say just, but I think COVID has my years mixed up. Before COVID, about 6 months prior to that, we had taken a trip, sort of a town gown trip with, our municipal leaders, Dartmouth College leaders, and some students to Denmark, and looking at sort of broad scale policy statements that then also mirror support to industry, and that have kind of like a whole of in this case, city approach to everything from waste to energy technology to utilizing available hybrid technology to looking at mobility trends. And I think, I don't know that I know of a country that's done it comprehensively right, but I think there's a lot of lessons learned, just seeing the interplay between industry, then consumer, and sort of the policy regulatory environment. So to me, that one really stands out.
So I'll admit my my area of expertise is New England, and that's going to show through in my answer. But I think some of the neighboring states right here in New England have interesting approaches, and I think one of the benefits of looking nearby is, every part of the world has different climate, different geography, different renewable resources that might or might not be available. And if you look to Vermont or Massachusetts or something like that, at least it's a place with pretty similar characteristics to New Hampshire. I think a couple of the things that maybe could be learned from neighboring states here in New England, from a few states, especially Massachusetts, just the idea that state policies really can shape a state's direction. I live in Massachusetts myself, and there are rooftop solar panels everywhere, and we have pretty aggressive energy efficiency programs. And I think if New Hampshire wanted to take a path like that, I think they could probably look to some of the neighboring states. I would also say something that Vermont does that I've found interesting is Vermont takes a very, I guess I'll say a very small scale granular approach to their energy planning. There aren't a lot of really big power plants in Vermont. They concentrate a lot more on the local distribution system. And I think from what I've heard from a couple of the statements today, and also at some of the other events earlier this week, I think the local community aspect of this seems to be important to New Hampshire, and I think Vermont might be a place to look that has kind of figured some of that out already.
Yeah, man, this question beyond my scope. I would say,
okay.
if you think about nuclear energy, France always the model country you can look at it, right? 70% electricity comes from nuclear energy. If you look at new renewable, Germany probably a better place to look at it. They already rely heavily on the wind turbine and the solar panel. They're giving up their coal-fired power plants.
Yeah.
If you think about geothermal, probably Iceland will be a better place to look at it, and Scotland particularly invested in wind energy. So I don't know.
Maybe the lesson there is invest in your strengths, right? See what resources you have and invest in those.
New Hampshire is very unique, very low population density and lots of trees. I'm not sure, maybe biomass conversion could contribute to certain things. I do not know, but I feel it's just start a communication, start a conversation, to learn from each other, just pros and cons, and do a matrix form. We have lots of smart people here, so we should be able to find a solution, I guess.
Yeah, maybe that's our strength. We'll invest in our people. Well, thank you all so much, Xiaowei, April, Daniel. I really appreciated our conversation and your contributions today. And for all the attendees, I really hope you enjoyed our panel. We have one last trivia question for you, and I think this is the trickiest. Even I would not have gotten this answer before I looked it up. So the question is, how many electric utilities are currently serving customers in New Hampshire? 3, 4, 6, or 9? And if you can name them all, I would be impressed without looking them up. I'm sort of telling you that it's more than 3. All right, let's see the results. Ooh, it's pretty tied. We have almost an even distribution of all the answers. So the correct answer is in fact 9. You all are probably most familiar with Eversource, Unitil, Liberty, and the New Hampshire Electric Co-op, but we do have a handful of municipal electric utilities in New Hampshire, including Wolfboro, Ashland, Woodsville, Littleton, and the New Hampton Village Precinct, which is the one that I didn't know about before I looked it up. Again, Energy Week would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So I do want to thank our Apex sponsor, Natixis, as well as our additional sponsors, New Hampshire Saves and Coca-Cola Northeast. Before you go, I just want to give you a quick reminder to use the link that Sheila will put into the chat for you all to sign up for upcoming events, including our Energy Champion Award ceremony, which we're really looking forward to. Thank you all so much, and we hope you can join us for the remaining New Hampshire Energy Week events. And thank you again one last time to our panelists. Goodbye, everyone.